Christy, have you ever handled a case involving a serial killer?
I think in my career, I have prosecuted 3 serial killers.
Oh, wait.
I would think that the most memorable was Juan Segundo. There was just something about his crime and the fact that it was a child that was our primary case. It was a young girl, Vanessa Villa, I'll never forget. She was 11 years old, and she had worked at the flea market with her mother all day. And they lived in a very modest home on the north side of Fort Worth. And they came home. It was a hot August night in Texas, and she was asleep on the bed she shared with her mother. And it was so hot, they had a fan in the open window of their house. And her mom and her siblings had left for a short time because I think one of her siblings had forgotten a pair of shoes. And in that very short time, when they returned, the mother came into into where Vanessa was asleep, and Vanessa was unclothed from the waist down, and she had marks around her neck, and she had curvilinear marks around her mouth from where someone had tried to stifle her screams, and her legs were spread. And there were, the only way I can describe it is muddy paw prints on both sides of the inside of her thighs. And she was clinging to life.
What happened after her mom found her baby girl like that?
Well, at that time, I think that was before we had 911, because there was an election and people had to decide whether or not to implement 911. But they called the police. And because it was a modest part of the town, people didn't get there quite as quickly. But the police got there as quickly as they could. Paramedics got there as quickly as they could. And they took Vanessa to the hospital and tried to revive her. But she died very, very quickly. And then a different team of professionals came through the house. And that would have been the homicide team and the crime scene team. And they collected sheets that had blood on it. And they collected the sheets that had, it was blood, but at the time, what else you could see, it just looked like water. The spot was wet. They collected all of that. They collected her clothing, and they collected her little panties and her little blue jean shorts, which I still remember to this day, one of the crime scene officers describing as soaked in urine, which told me she was terrified when those shorts were removed.
How long did the investigation take before they found out or identified a suspect?
Well, Fort Worth Police Department is one of the best police departments we have, and we had at the time as one of the best police departments. But there was only so much you could do. The list of suspects, they polygraphed people, they interviewed people, and the trail soon grew closed or grew cold. I remember they had a wake for the young girl at the time. They didn't have much money, so they had a wake at the house, and so family and friends could come to the house and pay their respects and say goodbye to Vanessa. And they had a guest book where everyone that was a guest that came to show their respects could sign. This would have been the mid-'80s, and we had a rash of young girls disappear. We had a rash of young girls being sexually assaulted. And so Fort Worth Police Department was very, very busy with all of the homicides that were occurring at that time. And so, unfortunately, days became weeks, weeks became months, and months became years. And meanwhile, all this evidence just sat locked in a freezer in the crime lab of the Fort Worth Police Department.
When was there a break in the case?
So sometime in the early, I want to say 2004, 2005, we had this new thing called DNA. And coincidentally, DNA was used for the first time in a forensic setting, meaning in a court setting, to solve a crime over in the UK in 1986, the same year that Vanessa was killed. But we didn't have that technology. So it would take all those years for that technology to cross the ocean, to cross the sea to our country, and to be accepted in courtrooms and to be accepted in Texas. And so in the early 2000s, probably around 2005, so mid-2000, the Fort Worth Police Department were in the process of going through all of their old cold cases. They had rape kits. When Vanessa had her autopsy was performed, the pathologist at the time would have collected samples, the traditional samples that you would take in a rape kit. So there was a rape kit, and then there were also these sheets that were collected and seized as evidence. And so because of this grant, this extra money, Fort Worth began testing all of these old cases or cold cases. And lo and behold, they had a hit. The Fort Worth Police Department had gotten some kind of money, some kind of grant to test pieces of evidence that had previously been untested in cases that had completely grown cold. I mean, we had hundreds upon hundreds of unsolved homicides at the time. And we had a hit. And what a hit means is all of a sudden there's some identification to another DNA profile in a national database. And so they kind of look back and say, well, who is this person? Do they have an alibi? Were they in Fort Worth at the time? And as it turned out, the individual was not only in Fort Worth at the time, was friends of the family, and had attended her wake and even signed the guest book.
Was he around? Did they arrest him?
Juan Segundo was arrested. And it was shortly thereafter that they discovered he was connected to another cold case, a sexual assault of a young woman who I think had been a prostitute at some point in her life. She was found deceased, and his DNA was found on her. And then I was actually on maternity leave when we learned that there was a third hit of a young woman, a stranger, who had been sexually assaulted and killed. And they were all killed the same way. They were all killed by means of strangulation. They were all sexually assaulted, and they all had one thing in common, and that is Juan Segundo's DNA. What was interesting is the reason that Juan Segundo's DNA was in the database to begin with was because he went to prison for a DWI. And when he went to prison, everybody at that time in the 2000s had started having to give a sample of their DNA. And so because of that sample and contemporaneous with that, Fort Worth Police Department are checking these pieces of evidence on cold cases. They connected the two. And then his DNA is in the database, and lo and behold, they're checking all of these other cases, and two more pop up and are connected to him. I mean, there are other differences in the crime because the other two women were found outside, and they were adults, and they were found outside in a field, basically. Vanessa was found in a house. And the other thing that was so terrifying about her case, just to go back a moment, is what was very clear is it was so hot, the fan was in the window, and the fan had been moved. And so we knew that Segundo had come in through the window, had watched her and waited for the mom to leave, and seized his opportunity to sexually assault her and kill her.
Do you remember when you got brought into the case?
I was brought in the case in 2005. I was brought in the case. I was expecting my second child, and the head of our trial division, Alan Levy, came and asked me if I was interested in trying these cases. And I felt and I feel very strongly about sexual assaults of women, and in particular, capital murders where sexual assault is the underlying felony. And I don't think there's anything worse than sexually assaulting and killing a child. And I think at the time we thought the mom was gone for 20 minutes to an hour, but still that's not a long amount of time. That's not a big amount of time for someone unless they're watching the house and they're spying. I've got this window of opportunity. They leave, and he didn't have any idea where they were going or how long they'd be gone. I mean, for all he knew, they could have been gone for 10 minutes and been right back. But I also remember that next to the window, on the outside of the window, there was this old plastic paint jug, like you get at Lowe's or Home Depot, and it was turned upside down so he could stand on it because he was short and climb through the window.
At what point was it decided that the death penalty would be sought?
Fairly early on. I mean, we knew we had, at the time I was brought on the case, I think we knew we had 2 capital murders of women, okay? Because we had a sexual assault as the underlying felony and then a homicide as well. And together that makes capital murder. And he had a criminal history. And it wasn't just some innocuous criminal history. He had a violent criminal history. He had a predatory criminal history. He had assaulted another woman and gone to prison. He had climbed in through another woman's window, and she awoke to see him and jumped out of a second-story window to escape from him. And so he was convicted of burglary in that case. And so we really had a predatory history. And when we were in the process of preparing for trial, we learned that I don't recall if it's daughter or stepdaughter, had also been sexually abused by him for years. It might have been when he dated the girl's mother. But in any event, he had also sexually abused a child for years. And her testimony that day, I still remember, her testimony that day was gripping. I mean, no one moved in the courtroom just listening to her relive the abuse she suffered at his hands. He was bad. He was the definition of a serial killer. He was the definition of a predator. And, there's lots of ways, this sounds terrible to say, there are lots of ways that people die. There are lots of ways that murders are committed. But a strangulation is an up-close and personal way of killing someone. I mean, he literally felt the life leave at least 3 bodies, 3 women, and a child. And I say 3 because after we tried him and after the jury chose to give him the death penalty, we discovered that there was yet a 4th young lady who had died at his hands. In all, there were 4 victims that we know of. In cases where there weren't DNA, he could have still been responsible, and we'll never know. And I'll remember the names of those women forever. Vanessa Villa, Maria Navarro, Frances Williams, Melissa Badillo. The first one was in 1986, and we tried him in 2006. So it was 20 years. It was 2 decades since the capital murder had occurred. And when you try a case for the death penalty as a prosecutor, guilt should be a foregone conclusion. And I know that there was a discussion, and this was the very first case that we sought the death penalty when what we had really was scientific evidence. We didn't have witnesses that put him at the scene, which in many respects, this made the case more solid. But we didn't know, or made it stronger, but we didn't know what a jury would do and whether or not it would be the kind of case that a jury might say, yes, he was very dangerous, but he was very dangerous 20 years ago. Sometimes you don't know how someone dies, but every one of the family members in these cases knew how their loved one spent their last moments on earth. And that was a long wait.
Walk me through the most memorable points of the trial.
The memorable moments of the trial, I remember, because I've tried cases when they were very, very old cases and they were very, very new. I remember we did not necessarily have autopsy photos. What we did have, though, were pictures, and they were black and white, just of Vanessa's body on the table. And I remember those muddy paw prints on the inside of her thighs. And I remember thinking, what a monster. What a monster that he could do that to this little girl. And the terror she must have felt to have wet her pants. And to know that he must have been stifling her screams for her mother when he covered her mouth and left those fingerprint impressions or those fingernail impressions. I remember the pictures of the evidence that were black and white. I remember the Polaroids of her little panties, and they were pink, I still remember, but they were Polaroids. I remember we had police officers who had since retired, but they remembered this case. When we were having to prove up the chain of custody for the DNA, for the sheets, we had to fly in people from Colorado, from different states, because they'd all since retired, and we had to reassemble them, and they had to find their notes, they had to find their test reports, and everybody was willing to and wanted to see that justice was done in this case.
And was it?
The DNA was found in different locations on the 3 women, on the 2 adult women, and then on Vanessa. And I remember my co-counsel, Alan Levy, brilliant trial lawyer, saying, because the defense was trying to say, well, the other women weren't, or that he wasn't responsible for their deaths. And I remember Alan saying something like, Where you find a dead woman who's been sexually assaulted, there you find his DNA. And it is like the mark of Zorro. And I was in awe of his closing argument. And then I remember being asked to give the closing argument and punishment, and I thought I was going to throw up because I was sitting here trying it with the head of the trial division, and it was a huge case. It was a very powerful case, and I felt so strongly about it. And this was a true story. I remember I had 2 children at the time. One was still a baby, and then I had a 2.5-year-old at the time we tried the case, or actually he was 3, and 3.5. He came to the side of my bed one night, and I had just received the file on the case. And back then, nothing was digital, nothing was electronic, everything was hard copy. And so I had been going through the case, looking at everything, looking at the sexual assault exam, looking at the pictures, and I closed the file, and I left a little bit early that day because I thought, I've had enough. I need a break. And I went home that night, and Christopher, my son, came to the side of the bed because he'd had some nightmare. And I remember telling him, it's okay. There's nothing to fear in the night. There's nothing that will get you. There's no such thing as monsters. And I knew that I was lying when I told him that. And that was my closing argument to the jury, that there are such things as monsters and there are things to fear in the night. And she died knowing that was the truth. She died feeling his hands wrapped around her throat and him being aroused at sexually assaulting her and stealing the life from her eyes.
Did y'all get to bring all the victims in guilt innocence, or you just had Vanessa, right?
So it was a big battle of wills as to whether or not we were going to get to bring in all of the complainants, all of the victims in guilt innocence. In the end, the judge ruled that and the judge was wise. At the time when you're a prosecutor, you want all of your evidence in at guilt innocence. So there's absolutely no question that the jury does the right thing. But the judge was very wise, and she was stepping back, seeing the whole trial play out. And so she was correct in her decision. And she allowed us, obviously, to prove up Vanessa's death and to prove up one of the other adult victims. But she had us reserve the third for the punishment phase, which in the end helped us because just in case the jury thought, oh, wait, that's it. There are only 2. But wait, there's more. Here's a third. You know what they struggled with? They struggled with, is there a reason to spare his life? That's what it was. Is there a reason to spare his life? Because the law that we were trying under at the time, we had to try it under 1986 law. So there was not life without parole. It was a life sentence, which was much, much, much shorter back then. And I remember they sent out questions about his conversion because part of what the defense put in was the fact that he'd been baptized, the fact that he joined a church in Keene. And so I remember Alan was like, they're hanging up on this. And I said, but that also says they're on the last question. And they ultimately came together and believed that the death penalty was appropriate. He looked at Vanessa Villa as the object of his desire. And whereas we are horrified at the notion of what she suffered, he was aroused. It was one of the most memorable cases and definitely the most memorable closing arguments I've ever delivered.